Let's start with the story. Out in the middle of the desert, surrounded by nothing for miles around, are a series of concentric rock rings sticking out of the desert sands. These are called the Eye of the Sahara, also known as the Richat structure. Now, these rings match pretty closely Plato's description of Atlantis. Could this have been the place where the ancient civilization lived before it was washed away? In this video, I want to examine the three central claims that the Richat structure was once home to the lost city of Atlantis. What is the evidence behind those claims? Are they supported? And does it actually point to Atlantis really existing and being at this location? This is my first video of this type, so I hope you like it. If you have any feedback, anything you think I could do better or change, please let me know. And let's get into it. Alright, let's get into the three central claims. I think this theory needs all three of them to be at least plausible for this to move forward. If we're missing one or more, then this is just really not feasible, that this location would ever be Atlantis. So let's look at claim number one. This claim is that the structure roughly aligns to Plato's description of Atlantis, given its concentric rings, its size, its scale, its location. That this place just as vaguely could have been passed down through oral history as Atlantis. If it doesn't match it at all, then even if there was some ancient civilization there, not Atlantis. Claim number two. There was water here in ancient times, enough that a large civilization could have existed, thrived, been thought of more of like an island nation, and eventually be wiped out in massive flooding. If there's not water, couldn't have been a large civilization, couldn't have been wiped out in flooding, and doesn't really match what we think of Atlantis to be as. And then three, there has to be evidence of large-scale habitation in this location. People lived here, there was a civilization, and even if it was wiped out in a flooding, we should still see some evidence of that at the location. If this doesn't exist, we're pretty confident. This is the most important one. If this doesn't exist, could not have been Atlantis. Claim number one. It looks like it. The Richat structure matches the description that Plato gives enough that it should be considered a likely location. Is this true? And what does that mean? Let's get into Plato's description of Atlantis. Number one, it is an island consisting mostly of mountains in the northern portions. 2. Poseidon carved the mountain where his love dwelt into a palace and enclosed it with three circular moats of increasing width, varying from 1 to 3 stadia and separated by rings of land proportional in size. 3. They dug a great canal to the sea, and alongside the bridges carved tunnels into the rings of rock. So, this is the description we have of Atlantis. Let's see, does the Richat structure match this?
Alright, let's look at the Richat structure from satellite to see how well it matches Plato's description. The first point that Plato gives is the mountain range in the north of the island. And if we look at this in Google Earth, we can see something that looks kind of like mountains or a cliff chain to the north of the Richat structure. And we will look at elevation. It really only goes about 300 meters above the Richat structure, which I personally would not call a mountain. But for this case, I'll give it to him. I'll just call it plausible. The highest point in Florida is, I think, not even above 100 meters. So this is 2 or 3 times the height of Florida. So I can give it to him. Next, let's look at the rings. We can pretty clearly see the 3 rings here. In Plato's description, he describes them as being 2 to 600 meters in width. These are about 5 to 10 times larger, depending on how you measure it. But we can call this one plausible as well, It matches just about as well as anything you're going to find. And people can always just say, oh, it's a story from thousands of years ago. It's not going to be completely fake, but they might have got the numbers wrong. Now, last point. Is there any evidence of a canal? When we look at the LiDAR, I personally don't see that much. And personally, this makes me less convinced of the other points. When I look at this, like there's some natural breaks in each of the rings, especially if you look at this one. But there's nothing really that screams Grand Canal to me here. The closest thing are these little divots right here. But even those, that's kind of I'm not seeing too much there. And honestly, this makes me more dismissive of the theory in general, because you can see the outer ring here. Very much, it is a lot lower than the other ones. So if there was any level of water causing moating in these inner rings, this outer one would be completely submerged to begin with. Not to mention this whole side of this ring. I'll call the Grand Canal. I'm not seeing it here. The rest of this idea for this location matching Plato's description, I can call it plausible. So how strong is this claim, and what does it prove? This claim boils down to the idea that it looks like it, which it kind of does. It is a large ring structure in a somewhat believable area, and this is not very common globally, so it's a pretty unique place. But there's not much outside of that. Just because something looks like another thing doesn't necessarily prove much. This happens a lot, especially in conspiracies, where somebody will point to something and say, hey, doesn't this look like this? Or isn't it strange that it looks this way? And that might be true, but things often look strange in the real world, even if they aren't. I think back to two really good examples of this, being the Devil's Tower in Wyoming that kind of looks like a tree stump. And people always look at this, and there's many theories around this being some type of ancient petrified tree, which it's not. It's pretty clearly volcanic activity caused. And another one being the Antarctic Pyramid. This is a mountain in Antarctica that really does look like a pyramid from aerial photography, and it's hard to get to because it's in a remote area of Antarctica. But these are also pretty common, at least relatively. There's a Wikipedia page for them on pyramidal peaks. This is a relatively common geological structure. This one particularly is very clean, but we know what causes this, and we've been to many of them, and we're pretty sure there's really no evidence of any man-made construction on these in the same way there is for the pyramids in Egypt or in South America. So I would just be on the lookout for claims like this in any type of theory you're hearing, because people very often treat this as conclusive evidence of, look how close they look, when really this doesn't prove anything. It's just a good starting off point for an actual theory. You do have to actually go there and look deeper to find actual evidence. You can't just say that two things look similar, unfortunately. So for now, I'll call this claim plausible, and we can move on to the second claim. There was water here in ancient times. This claim centers around the fact that water could have been here prior to 12,000 years ago. Enough water that people could have lived here, built a civilization, and that the rings of the Richat structure could have been filled with water and acted as moats, like Plato describes. This idea kind of goes back to the Younger Dryas impact theory, which I'm sure a lot of people have already heard of, which is an idea that a comet impacted the northern hemisphere around 12,000 years ago, causing the Younger Dryas climatic period. This was a period of rapidly melting ice and water level rise, which coincides with how a lot of people think about Atlantis and the massive flooding. So let's look at this a bit deeper. Was there water here prior to 12,000 years ago? And is there any evidence of flooding in the area? All right, so if we take a look at historic water levels, there is evidence of the Sahara having a lot more water around this time. The Sahara itself was pretty lush and green 5,000 to 11,000 years ago, but there's no real evidence that would put the Richat structure at sea level. That would be a really drastic change. It's currently at about 300 meters elevation, and if water levels ever got that high, it would be pretty disastrous for most of the world. So there's no real evidence that this was ever close to the ocean. But there could have been water, but it's quite a big stretch for this to be coastal in any way. If there's one thing we know about Atlantis, it's that it's sunk into the ocean or is washed away in a flood. The theory I see going around about this the most has to do with the Younger Dryas impact theory. This is the idea that comets or a chain of comets smashed in to the northern hemisphere, caused massive flooding, melting of the glaciers, and could have wiped out any of these civilizations. Now, what I see most surrounding the Richat structure is we kind of see this pattern out in the desert. It looks like the sand's been swept from the east across the west and out towards the ocean. Could this have been caused by the Younger Dryas impact? And could it have been caused by that massive flooding that wiped out Atlantis? Most likely no, because we know what causes this pattern in the desert. There's something called the trade winds or the westerlies, which is a very important global effect where there's winds that blow dry, dusty air out from the Sahara west over the Atlantic Ocean. And this air and dust acts as fertilizer for the Amazon rainforest, which allows it to grow. So we know quite a bit about this phenomenon, and it was not caused by any type of massive flooding. So there are a couple other potential examples of where this water could have come from. If we look very far northeast, there's the Mediterranean, and then during the humid period in Africa, there were a few mega lakes throughout the Sahara. The first one being Mega Lake Chad, which would be way down here. Now, I would say the Mediterranean and Mega Lake Chad are quite a bit too far for them to have impacted the Richat structure. This is just a vast distance to cover that it would make absolutely no sense for the water to have traveled in this direction. There was one more lake that could have impacted this. To the far northeast of Mauritania and western Algeria, there was a mega lake in this area as well. But even if that one collapsed in some type of glacial burst or comet impact, it would be very unlikely to have went anywhere near the Richat structure. Just given the elevation structure of the area, it very much more would have gone out towards the ocean, which is what we would expect, because water runs towards low elevation sites. And to travel all the way to the Sahara, it would have needed to travel uphill for a very long distance, like hundreds of miles, which water just doesn't really do. So for this claim, I'm going to give it really not plausible, in my opinion. There was water at this location that could have allowed civilizations to exist, but we really don't see any evidence of flooding at the location, and we don't see any evidence that massive flooding could have wiped out a civilization here, at least not without some type of world-changing type of event, even greater than a comet impact. And so for this claim, it does very little to prove that Atlantis existed here. This claim relies mostly on the listener's imagination to fill in the missing information, because we don't have any evidence of massive flooding, but as long as you can imagine that there was water here at this location at some point, then you can kind of justify it to yourself that, hey, maybe it's possible, but we really just have no evidence of the massive flooding that this story calls for. A large civilization existed at this location. Claim number 3. This claim might sound a bit different from the first two, and I want you to take note of that. The first two claims, even if they are true, don't actually prove that Atlantis existed. This is something that often happens with conspiracy theories, where the evidence, even if it is true, doesn't go that far to prove the main hypothesis, while the primary theory and a lack of evidence for it is entirely secondary. Our primary question is, did Atlantis exist in the Richat structure? Whether the area was habitable or whether it matches Plato's description doesn't actually prove this. They're merely things that make it possible. But if we want to support our primary argument, we have to find actual evidence. All these other claims that surround the central one, they aren't actually giving proof. What they're doing is they're creating a hole of plausibility. And as long as the theory isn't impossible, then the listener can fill in that hole with whatever hopes and dreams they want to exist. But let's focus on our claim. Is there evidence of habitation and large-scale civilization in this area? The answer to that is no. There's never been a real large-scale civilization around the Richat structure. And the evidence is actually worse than that for the theory. Because there is evidence of small-scale habitation, even prior to 12,000 BC, when Atlantis would have been destroyed. This implies that a large-scale civilization didn't leave behind any evidence, but small-scale hunter-gatherers living at this location did leave behind evidence that wasn't wiped away in a flood. So we can really say here conclusively that there has been no large-scale civilization at this location. Otherwise, we would have found evidence. Even if there was flooding that wiped away the vast majority of it, they would have left some amount of evidence. They would have at least left more than the primitive hunter-gatherers that were there before them. So this is really just the death nail in this theory, I think. You can claim it's possible as much as you like, but if there's no evidence of massive amounts of people living there, then they probably weren't there. Civilization leaves behind evidence. Even if we don't know very much about it, we can usually tell that they existed at a place. And in this case, with the Richat structure, there just isn't any evidence there. An advanced prehistoric civilization could have existed in China. It could have existed in the Mississippi Basin or the Indus Valley. Each of these locations had plentiful resources and water, but there's no evidence for them existing. We haven't found structures, tools, evidence of farming, or changes in the soil record. There's no evidence of anything but hunter-gatherers prior to the conventional start of civilization. This is what I want to leave you with. When somebody is trying to prove an idea, don't get distracted by whether it is possible or not, with air quotes. Look for what evidence they actually put forth. There's a lot of things that are possible, but unless we have evidence that they actually happened, they probably didn't. So Atlantis could have existed, and honestly, I wish it did. I love the idea more than anybody else, but we just don't have evidence that it does exist. People pushing these Atlantis theories, like Graham Hancock or Jimmy Corsetti, they nibble at the edges to try and convince people that it's possible, but they avoid the central question. Is there any evidence that an ancient advanced civilization existed? And the answer, at least for now, is no. And they can ask us to dig up the entire Sahara Desert before they admit it, but that's not how science works. If you want to prove something, you have to put forth evidence. And they just don't have it. So thank you for watching. Like and subscribe if you want more poorly made content. And leave a comment if there are any other conspiracy theories you want me to cover in the future. Thanks.